In times when Mr. Harvey was too ill to record his broadcasts, he turned that Herculean task over to the creator and sole writer of the rest of the story, his son. Here's Paul Harvey Jr.
Now, the rest of the story. Natalie was 20, pretty, and pregnant, and she and her husband Martin did so want a baby girl. The couple lived in a two-family house at 415 Monroe Street in Hoboken, New Jersey. It was a modest but happy home not far from the railroad yards and the docks. Martin was a small businessman. He owned a tavern in town. Natalie, in addition to being a housewife, was a practical nurse, and now she was pregnant. All through the fall, the expectant parents made plans for the new arrival. On what day would she be born, they wondered, and whom would she take after? It was always she. The young mother-to-be even purchased pink baby clothing, so certain was she of a daughter. How frivolous those considerations must have seemed on that chilly December morning so many years ago. Natalie's mother, Rosa, had been up with her daughter most of the night. It was a difficult labor, and now, by the dawn's early light, still no child. Now, Mama Rosa, as she was called, having borne 9 children of her own, had developed a reliable intuition about these things. And she knew that this time something was terribly wrong. By the time Dr. Peterson arrived, Natalie was many hours into her labor. A quick examination revealed the difficulty. The child was simply too large and unable to move. It would have to be a so-called forceps delivery. Well, minutes later, the child was born thus, but utterly quiet. The left side of the infant's head had been lacerated by the forceps. The left ear was almost severed. "I'm sorry," said Dr. Peterson gravely, "the child is stillborn." And now the only question was, could Natalie be saved? Well, as Dr. Peterson did everything he could to stop the hemorrhaging, Mama Rosa, Natalie's mother, gazed at the silent infant in disbelief. Her grandchild born dead? No, it must not be. And at that instant she remembered something one of her own midwives had told her long ago. Maybe she'd remembered it for a reason, for right here and now. Quickly, Mama Rosa took the infant to the wash basin, placed it under a cold water tap, and turned on the faucet. A moment went by, but nothing. Another moment, and the baby the doctor had given up for dead coughed, cried out, breathed in, and lived. And Natalie was as lucky as her newborn, because shortly thereafter the bleeding stopped. And as the bright Sunday sunlight danced on the freshly fallen snow, a new life was given to the world. Natalie's baby had weighed 13.5 pounds at birth. That had been the problem. But now mother and child were safe, so it didn't really matter much when Natalie discovered that her hoped-for she was a he. In fact, for the rest of his life, Natalie's baby boy would bear the scars from Dr. Peterson's forceps, as well as the name perhaps originally intended for a daughter, Frances. You see, the blue-eyed boy who in December 1915 was supposed to have been a girl, the infant the doctor thought was stillborn, and grew up to become Francis Albert, or as he preferred, Frank Sinatra. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. Frank Sinatra and his close-knit group of friends, which included Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop, and Peter Lawford, are often referred to as the Rat Pack, and Frank was undoubtedly its leader. Francis Albert Sinatra was born on December 12, 1915, as Paul Jr. explained. At a young age, Frank showed an interest in big band jazz, which was popular at the time. On his 15th birthday, Frank's uncle, Domenico, gave him a ukulele. Frank strummed his ukulele and sang at family gatherings. Thus began his lifelong devotion to music and his rise to fame and fortune. Now, I want to tell you about something that happened on Thursday, January the 6th, 1977. It was a cold day in Palm Springs, California, colder than usual. Dolly Garaventa and Ann Carboni, both wealthy, elderly widows, had big plans for the weekend. They were going to fly into Las Vegas to see Frank Sinatra's opening night performance at Caesar's Palace and then do a little gambling.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And welcome to Caesar's Palace.
Dolly was a long-time fan of the Rat Pack crooner and had seen Frank perform more times than she could count. Dolly and Ann made their way to the airport and boarded a private Learjet piloted by Donald Weir and Gerald Foley. At about 5 o'clock that evening, the air traffic controller gave the pilots permission to take off. The jet left the runway and began to climb. At just over 11,500 feet, San Gorgonio Mountain is one of the highest peaks in the continental United States and the highest peak in Southern California. On this day, San Gorgonio Mountain was covered by several feet of freshly fallen snow, and it was still snowing. Normal procedure was for aircrafts arriving and departing from the Palm Springs airport to fly around the mountain, but not over it. The air traffic controller watched as the jet reached 9,000 feet, traveling 345 miles per hour. Then just 4 minutes after takeoff, the Learjet disappeared from the screen. The air traffic controller was in disbelief, and he looked more closely at the radar screen, but the jet was gone. He immediately notified search and rescue teams who gathered at the mountain to search for the missing jet. Just before he was about to walk on stage, Sinatra learned about the missing jet and its passengers. Frank was visibly shaken backstage, but as the true professional he was, he performed the matinee and evening shows just as planned. The crowds at both shows remembered that Frank performed impeccably. No one in the crowd knew of his concern. Off stage, however, Frank waited impatiently for any news. Teams of search and rescue personnel searched the mountain, but were hindered by the driving snow. Unable to continue the search that day, the 35 searchers spent the frigid night in tents on San Gorgonio Mountain. The search resumed the next morning. The searchers struggled to move in the waist-deep snow. They looked for any fresh damage to the trees on the mountain, but found nothing. The search continued. On Sunday, January 9th, 3 days after the Learjet disappeared, a searcher in a helicopter spotted a coat hanging in a tree. A few feet away, he saw a muumuu-style dress hanging in another tree. He then saw luggage scattered about on the snow-covered ground, followed by the remains of the Learjet. The jet had disintegrated on impact, and all aboard were killed instantly. The pilots, investigators concluded, never knew they were in any sort of trouble. Frank Sinatra was distraught and canceled all of his shows following the second show on the night the jet disappeared. But Dolly was more than just Frank Sinatra's biggest fan. She was with Francis Albert Sinatra when he was born. You see, Dolly, the wealthy widower who was killed in the Learjet crash, was Frank Sinatra's mother, Natalie Garaventa, they called her Dolly, Sinatra. San Gorgonio Mountain has had several other aircraft crashes. On Saturday, March 21st, 1987, 10 years after the Learjet crash, Captains Raymond Ortiz and Paul Martin piloted one of 3 California Air National Guard F-4C Phantom jets like this one in formation near San Gorgonio Mountain. The trio of F-4C jets took off about 1:45 p.m. on a weekend training mission. The mountain was nearly invisible in the heavy cloud cover. The jets traveled at an altitude of about 9,300 feet at 400 miles per hour. Air traffic controllers ordered the 3 jets to make a left turn to avoid close contact with the mountain. The pilots of 2 of the jets acknowledged the order and made the left turn. but Captains Ramon and Paul never responded. Similar to Dolly's jet crash, air traffic controllers focused on the radar screen, but the F-4C Phantom was gone. The jet disappeared just 10 minutes after it left the airport. As with Dolly's crash, searchers converged on the mountain to look for the jet, but snow, which reached depths of up to 8 feet, made the search nearly impossible. Both pilots had extensive training in survival techniques, including snowy terrain. Searchers and family members held out hope that the two pilots had survived. To everyone's surprise, searchers found two pilots alive and well who had survived a plane crash. Word quickly spread about the safe pilots. Families and friends of the F-4C pilots were relieved, but only temporarily. The pilots who were found alive and well were from a different plane crash on the same mountain at the same time. The search resumed. From daylight until dark, searchers slowly scoured the mountain. At night, they slept in tents on the freezing mountain. On Wednesday, March 25th, 6 days after the jet disappeared from radar, searchers located the crashed F-4C Phantom. The pilots had made no attempt to eject from their jet. They both died instantly. Investigators concluded, like Dolly's crash, that they never knew they were in any sort of danger. San Gorgonio Mountain, the same mountain which claimed the life of the mother of Frank Sinatra, also claimed Paul Martin, Dean Paul Martin, the oldest son of Rat Pack crooner Dean Martin. This episode is dedicated to the memory of Dolly Sinatra and Dean Paul Martin. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.